Okay, lots to talk about tonight, so let's get right at it. Andrew and Chantal are in the house, and so is Huffington Post Ottawa Bureau Chief Althea Raj. Topic 1, Bombardier. 7,000 layoffs, and then minutes later, a new almost $4 billion deal with Air Canada for new planes, all set against the backdrop of a Bombardier request for about $1 billion in a loan from Ottawa. All that happening on the same day, yesterday. Does all that make sense? Andrew?
It makes sense politically, I suppose. It was remarkable, wasn't it, that Air Canada, which had not previously shown much interest in buying the plane, suddenly decided on that very day that it wanted to, on the same day that there was the Quebec government dropped a lawsuit against it, on the same day that the federal government said that they would release them from previous undertakings they'd made, and everybody insisting, well, this is just a commercial deal. Well, come on. So this is prelude, one presumes, to further dollops of assistance on top of the previous hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that Bombardier has received.
About $1.5 billion, I think, at least from Ottawa.
Yeah, that's right.
Of which they've paid back about $500 million.
They've only just gotten $1.5 billion from the Caisse de dépôt for their train operations, $1.3 billion from the Quebec government for the C-Series plane, which is the source of Bombardier's difficulties. I guess, you sort of look at this and it reminds me a bit of that talking point the Tories bring out about the ISIS mission. If you wouldn't fight ISIS, who would you fight? If you would subsidize Bombardier, who wouldn't you subsidize? This is a company that's lost $5 billion in the last year, that's got its flagship operation, the C-Series, is 2 years behind schedule, $2 billion over budget, hasn't sold a plane in a year. The only reason it seems to be that people are in favor of subsidizing it now is because we subsidized it in the past, and so we've got all these hostages in the form of the thousands of people working for it, and or because Ontario and the feds gave money to the auto sector, so now you have to pay out to Bombardier. And there'll be other shoes to drop after this, of course, because Brad Wall in Saskatchewan is already saying, well, if you're going to give money to Bombardier, what about us?
And I'll show you those quotes in a minute.
Just to make Brad Wall a bit clearer, and not that I'm a spokesperson, but what he's really saying is if you're going to help Bombardier, you should in exchange get some kind of cooperation on Energy East and the pipeline. I'm not sure you can make a deal like that. Certainly no one can sign on the dotted line anywhere for Energy East in Quebec. But what I do know is this request for more money from Bombardier has been in the federal environment since before the election. It didn't happen this week. But if you're going to say no to that, and you can if you're the federal government, you will have a harder time getting cooperation on Energy East. That's a no-brainer. So I'll flip the proposition from Premier Brad Wall. The other issue is, yes, we did bail out the auto industry, and if you didn't like that bailout, you're being consistent by not liking the Bombardier bailout. Makes perfect sense. There is also an economic case for helping out Bombardier. And there is an industrial strategy case. You can disagree with it or not, which is that before you say let it sink, you have to decide whether you want your aerospace industry to sink, because Bombardier is Canada's aerospace industry. So all these considerations are outside of the politics of it. If you're a Liberal government with serious real estate in Montreal and Quebec, at a time when employment and unemployment is high, and you were elected to keep the economy going, it's going to be very hard to say no.
All right. Because you both raised Brad Wall, I want to show you actually a couple of different things. And then, Althea, you can jump in here and tell me what's actually happening here in terms of a national story, because everybody's getting involved in this now. First of all, yesterday, you have Premier Philippe Couillard saying this about the need for loans to Quebec, or to Bombardier. Right?
There is no way that the federal government should not invest in Bombardier, in the C-Series. If the auto industry has been supported by taxpayer money, which is fine, then the aeronautical industry of Montreal needs also to be supported.
All right, so there you have it. Kind of Ontario and Quebec involved, and then Brad Wall today on Facebook. Here's what he said. If the federal government is considering a $1 billion bailout to address 2,830 Canadian job losses at Bombardier, what about the tens of thousands of job losses in Canada's energy sector? We could start with Energy East maybe, and an oil well cleanup initiative. So here you've got everybody getting involved in this, and kind of the old Canadian story. Fine, what about us? What's your take on this?
Well, I mean, that's what the Conservatives are doing in the House of Commons, too. I mean, Rona Ambrose was up there saying, if you're going to do this for Quebec, well, what about the 100,000 workers in Alberta? What about them? And what about all the oil companies that might be going bankrupt? Are you going to help them as well? I think there's a point where, where do you draw the line? But to Chantal's point, I mean, there's a national domestic reason why you would want to support Bombardier. Airbus and Boeing are supported as well. It's not like they're competing in an unsubsidized industry. But that said, it is pretty interesting that they have sat on their hands for 4 months, have not really told us what type of horse trading they may be trying to do in the background.
So they being here,
the Liberal government.
Right.
But when you do point out to them how neatly the Air Canada deal seems to have fallen, they say, no, we applied no pressure at all on this request. We had nothing to do with it. And only sort of behind the scenes confirm the fact that they did, in fact, agree to modify the act that governs Air Canada to allow it more flexibility in terms of where it does its maintenance.
If anyone got a sweet deal out of this, I would say it's Air Canada. I'm convinced they got these planes they're ordering at a fairly
apparently 60%
nice
off.
price. They got off the hook for some of the conditions that are in their act. And Quebec dropped a suit that it was winning against them for closing down a maintenance center at Aveos. So I'm thinking the people who are sitting back thinking, boy, have we done well out of this. Plus, they got no jets out of Billy Bishop, which Air Canada opposed when Porter wanted to do it. So
And
I'm
who knows
thinking...
what other shoes to drop. We should
And
be
the
clear.
Billy Bishop being the Toronto Island Airport where they wanted to get in.
We should be clear. The willingness of other countries with much deeper pockets than ours, Airbus, Embraer from Brazil, Boeing from the United States, the willingness of those countries to subsidize their planes is an argument against us joining it, not in favor of it. If we were the only country to hit on this scheme of let's subsidize our aircraft and we can win some kind of worldwide monopoly by doing so, that might make some theoretical sense. But all we're doing is getting into a game of matching subsidies against, as I say, people with much deeper pockets than ours. It is a less than zero-sum game.
Now,
I don't disagree, but there's we're talking innovation, R&D, good value jobs. We can't at the same time say we're not only natural resources and say, but we're not big enough to compete in the big leagues on aerospace.
We're not big enough to compete in the big leagues of subsidize. But there's nothing, you said quite rightly that...
you can't compete without subsidies.
You said quite rightly that we have to decide whether we're going to be in aerospace or not, but we shouldn't take it as a given that we have to be in aerospace. And a lot of this discussion proceeds from that as a kind of an a priori assumption that civilized countries have to be in aerospace. No,
But
they
if
don't.
we're not, what are we in?
Well, it's not for you or I to decide.
but what
it's for
are we
people
in?
risking their own capital to decide.
We're in oil.
There are 40
logs
Liberal
and-
seats in Quebec, and I
That
think
is
it's very
the germane
it is very unlikely that they do not offer some sort of aid to Bombardier.
Okay. I want to move on, but we should point out Andrew's at least consistent on the subsidy front. 'Cause
Yes, he is.
You were against the bailout of the, well, not bailout, but the loans to the auto industry.
It was a bailout.
It's a
There was a
bailout.
bailout. They got the money back, though,
didn't the
right?
taxpayers make money?
No,
Yeah,
we ended up losing
$4 billion
$3
short.
or $4
Okay,
billion
all right,
dollars,
okay.
just for the record.
3 or 4 billion.
Yeah,
Well,
what's
that's
that?
3 or
right?
4 billion.
You
right?
could bail out 4 times Bombardier with that.
All right. I want to shift topics here. Physician-assisted suicide. We know that the Supreme Court said you've got to have a decision, not only a decision, but a bill passed by June, and that's an extension of a few months. So next week, the committee report on physician-assisted suicide comes along, and from that, one assumes there will be a bill of some sort that the MPs will vote on. Here's the issue. The Liberals are saying there's got to be a whipped vote on that. In other words, all Liberals have to vote the way the government wants them to vote on this point. Here is what Justin Trudeau said in the last week of the campaign on his policy about whipped votes. Here it is.
We have a very clear policy on free votes that says elements that are in our platform, elements that are go to the heart of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and elements that are confidence matters, that is matters of budget. People would be expected to vote with the Liberal Party. On other issues, they would be expected to stand up for the interests of their constituents right across the country, because that's what we elect people to do.
All right, so the Liberals are already saying that whatever comes out of the physician-assisted suicide bill, it is a charter matter. Buy that?
Well, lots of things are charter matters, first of all. I mean, when you look at those exceptions he made to the general free vote rule, everything in our platform, which is 300 promises on everything under the sun. So that's everything. And then everything to do with the charter, which is everything else. So it doesn't leave a lot of room for free votes.
And the budget.
And the budget. It's absolutely true that the Supreme Court ruled that the old law was against the charter, but there's 100 possible laws you could bring in that would be in conformity with the charter. So to rule out all of those distinctions and just say, look, we're putting the hammer down, whatever law we bring in, you have to vote in favor of it because it's the charter. It seems to me to be far more sweeping than is necessary at all. Leaves no room for people to either represent either their own individual consciences or their constituencies' wishes. It just makes a mockery of the free vote pledge.
Althea, how is this flying with Liberal MPs?
Some Liberals are not actually sure whether or not to be upset yet because they don't know what the contents of the bills are, but they are upset that the directives seem to come out of the blue from the government House Leader, Dominic LeBlanc. There is no report. There is no bill. It's not even clear the Liberals need to whip this vote. Maybe they'd pass the legislation without whipping it. And then to come out after you campaign, as you showed in the clip, saying our MPs are going to be the voice of their constituents in Ottawa, not Ottawa's voice to their constituents, to stand up and say, no, this is going to be a whip vote, this is a charter issue, when the NDP of all parties, they whip their votes more than anybody, has decided that they're going to have a free vote. I think this actually shows the leadership style that we're starting to see from Justin Trudeau in the Prime Minister's office. This is not going to be a PMO that's going to be decentralizing. If anything, this is the first act of centralization that we've seen from this government.
Of course, the conscience vote is not a vote for your constituents. It is a vote on an issue that involves your personal convictions. You could argue with all kinds of ways. You could say it was part of the platform. They signed off on that when they ran for the Liberals and the abortion issue. And anything that under the sun about abortion is included in that promise. That was made clear before. You could also argue that this vote is not about a conscience issue. No one is going to be asked whether they accept medically assisted suicide or not. That's done. Mm-hmm. This is about process. Well, it is, though. I mean, the day after June 6th, the deadline, if nothing happens, medically assisted suicide happens. Since the government is not saying we want to invoke the notwithstanding clause and opt out of this ruling, that's what it's about. I personally think it's not a good idea because it diminishes the debate. A government that is not sure of the majority to pass a law will listen to the other points of the other parties. It will get buy-in from the other parties. And on issues like that, and this is an important fundamental issue, I think the buy-in and the legitimacy of that new law would be enhanced by a free vote, and I do believe it would pass.
All right. I've got to disagree on this question of whether it's just a process differences. When most people think they're talking about assisted suicide, most people, I think, have in their mind the idea of somebody who's near the end of their life, suffering from a painful, physically debilitating disease, they're terminal, they're an adult of sound mind, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you actually listen to the debate and the position of many of the advocates, most of those conditions are not what they have in mind. It's not going to be related to it. If they had their way, would not be restricted to physical illness, but also to psychological. It would not require.
But this can all be spilled out in the bill.
That's my point. Is you could bring in a bill that was very narrowly drawn along the lines I just suggested, or you could have one that's much more expansive that would include children, that would include the mentally handicapped. And I'm not slippery sloping here. This is the position of many of the advocates.
Okay, a quick last word, Althea. You were trying to make one there, but I'm almost out of time.
That's okay. Andrew kind of made it for me, but I think that it does make a mockery of the parliamentary process. If you know the vote is whipped, then what's the point of having the debate? What's the point of actually having committee studies, of hearing from witnesses? You know, this was supposed to be a great Democrat, and the first action on a controversial subject, he still just his cards.
All right. I'm sure over these next 6 months, we're going to be talking about this
maybe talking about
more a little bit. Yeah. All right. Thank you all.